maybe understandably so. But before we get into that, I want to ask you to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment before you fall asleep. And also to support me and my videos that are not monetized on YouTube, and to have access to more content like this and some more personal content. I want to ask you to check out my Patreon if you want to. That would help me a lot. Thank you so much. And now it is time to lay back. Of course, I'm not saying this conspiracy is true. But when I started digging into this, I just couldn't stop. And the deeper I went, the stranger it all got. Dinosaurs. We've seen them in museums, on movie screens, in childhoods, in our childhood books, and of course as emojis, or on every other children's t-shirt. We all think that we know them, at least a little. Giant lizards from a time before us, their bones buried deep under the earth. But what if, just what if, that story isn't what we think it is? But if the bones, the fossils, the very idea of dinosaurs were something else entirely? A mistake, or a fabrication, or even carefully constructed myth designed to make us believe something that never really existed. I know, it sounds insane. That's what I thought too. But just stay with me. But if you go through some interesting forums, old newspaper archives, and have forgotten museum records, you start to begin to notice a pattern of inconsistencies, things that just don't perfectly line up, and no one seems to question them, especially nowadays. So of course, let's start at the beginning. The first dinosaur bone ever discovered was supposedly found in the early 1800s by people who didn't even know what dinosaurs were. At the time, paleontology wasn't really a thing. It was more like a hobby for wealthy gentlemen who liked digging things out of the ground, which I'm also a fan of. They called them dragon bones or giant reptiles. And most of those early finds, they've never been verified. They were lost, mislabeled, or quietly replaced by replicas. Here's where it gets strange. When you look up early newspaper reports, you start to see how similar the stories sound. physical evidence survived from the beginning stages. Some researchers online, they claim that the same handful of people were behind almost all of those early discoveries. Names that appear again and again: Richard Owen, Gideon Mantel, Othniel Marsh, Othniel, and Edward Cope. These men were rivals and also, curiously enough, business partners in their museum ventures. It was a time when museums were desperate for public attention. They needed something big to draw in crowds, something never seen before. And what could be bigger than creatures that once ruled the earth? But here's the part that chills me. When you visit most major national history museums today, the ones that claim to display real dinosaur skeletons, what you're actually looking at are casts, plaster molds. The real bones, they say, are too fragile to display. They are kept in vaults or labs or archives that you can't visit. No cameras allowed. No public access. So you and I have never seen a real dinosaur bone. Or have we? We've only seen recreations. Now that alone doesn't prove anything sinister, but it sets a tone, because it means that everything we think we know, every shape, every roar, every towering skeleton in a museum is based on someone else's interpretation of this tiny little bone they found. An interpretation built on bones that, for the most part, we are not even allowed to see. There's another pattern that stands out when you read old field notes and expedition logs. Fossils are almost always found by people already connected to paleontology. You almost never hear about a random farmer digging up a Tyrannosaurus skull and taking it to the press. No, it's always university teams, museum staff, or private collectors. And those collections, yes, of course, they're locked away into their golden vaults. Some people online think this started as an honest mistake. A few bones misidentified, a few hoaxes that got out of control, and then over time it became a story too big to take back. Once museums had invested millions of dollars and their entire scientific careers depended on it, how could anyone ever admit that they just might be wrong, at least about some of the things they say are real? It's of course easier for them to double down to build bigger exhibits, to make better plaster casts, to make more money, and just to keep the illusion alive. But others on the internet and in the conspiracy corners, they even go further. They say it was never an accident. They believe the idea of dinosaurs was completely manufactured during the Industrial Revolution, and it was, of course, to support certain agendas. The age of the earth, evolution, even the oil industry, all the stuff. They say it's all connected. Because if you can convince people that the planet is millions of years old, that massive creatures lived and died long before humans existed, then you can just shape how society sees itself. You create a sense of insignificance, and it pushes us a little more to obedience to scientific authority. That's when the story gets political and deeply unsettling and very conspiratorial. As you start digging into history of paleontology, tracing the early steps those early fossil hunters took, you start to see that some of them are brilliant, others not so much, and the few were a little too eager to impress. Take the infamous Piltdown Man, Piltdown, Piltdown. It was discovered in the early 1900s. It was hailed as the missing link between apes and humans. Only decades later did scientists realize it was a complete hoax, a clever forgery. Bones were stained, carefully altered, and were designed to fool the experts of the time. It makes me wonder, if someone could fool the scientific world once, what else could happen? What else can they make the scientific field believe that is not correct? And of course the internet and its corners are full of conspiracies and whispers, of strange coincidences, missing fossils, unexplained replacements, inconsistencies in old records. People talk about disappearing bones, lost field notes, and skeletons that never made it to the public. Some people claim that museums, even today, have hidden basements filled with specimens the public is never meant to see. Some are ordinary fossils, they say, but some are puzzling. Bones that don't quite fit the official narrative, or fragments that don't match any known species. It's almost as if someone curated the story carefully, leaving only what was was necessary for the public, and whatever else that would make them question anything should be kept away. I found one account, posted anonymously of course, on a paleontology forum, from a former museum volunteer. They wrote, quote, "We were told to handle some specimens with extreme care. They didn't look fossilized, yet they were catalogued as millions of years old. I don't know what it was, but I felt uneasy." End quote. It's hard to verify these things, of course, but in the silence of the archives and the shadows of these old warehouses, it's easy to imagine secrets. And that is what we are mostly doing tonight. Imagining things and letting our mind wander just so that we can fall asleep. Then there's the story of early museum fundings. Industrialists and wealthy patrons poured money into excavations, expeditions, and exhibits. And why not? A museum filled with giants draws in crowds. Children gasp, scholars nod, and donors write checks. It's an empire built on fascination. And fascination can be carefully guided. Some researchers online point out that most of the spectacular dinosaur reconstructions, like the towering Tyrannosaurus rex, the long-necked Brachiosaurus, the armored Stegosaurus, were all assembled from incomplete bones. One leg here, a tail there, and the rest filled with plaster, imagination, and even artistic interpretation. And once those images were published, they became permanent in the public mind. Movies, books, toys, and eventually classrooms reinforcing a vision of history that is only partially real. But there are also strange anomalies that make the legend more unsettling. Consider this: how they're changing the dinosaur depictions over time, over the decades, to fit a more believable narrative. Early models showed dragging tails. Later, tails were raised. Theropods, once scaly, but now they are feathered in some of the reconstructions that are made of them. It's not that science is wrong, it's that the story itself evolved, as if it were being sculpted to match what people wanted to see. Some claim this curation of reality was intentional. Others see it as human nature, a tendency to fill gaps with their imagination when the evidence is just in fragments. I also have noticed the pattern of disappearances these original bones vanish, and that remains are plaster casts and hand-drawn reconstructions. So this species made of something that is not even here anymore. We don't have it, but the species are seen as real. And yet, through all of this, scientists continue to study dinosaurs, refine their ideas, and occasionally find new species. There is real evidence: fossilized bones, dragways, eggs, and nests. But in the back of my mind, a small voice whispers, the public story, the one we see in museums and movies, is only part of the truth. And I don't like that a lot of the remains are locked away. The legend gets even creepier when you consider the psychological side. Why do people want to believe in dinosaurs? Part of it is awe. Part of it is fear. A massive predator roaming the earth. A beast from a forgotten world. It's thrilling and terrifying. And a story like that can be shaped, molded, emphasized, or even fabricated without people even realizing. Some of the oldest hoaxes in natural history were small. A fake fossil here, a misidentified bone there. But over time, hoaxes build upon hoaxes, and the story becomes self-reinforcing. Once it's in books, films, and classrooms, it's nearly impossible to separate imagination from reality. I found one particularly strange report. A private collector who supposedly bought fossil specimens that didn't match anything in the scientific literature. They claimed the bones were real, but out of place. Odd shapes, unusual textures, and they were never authenticated, never studied publicly. And then the collector disappeared from online forums. A thread vanished. There are screenshots that only hint at this story. All of this has created a growing unease in me. If so many gaps exist in the history of dinosaurs, in their records, and in their reconstructions, what does that leave us with? Do we not believe the skeletons in the museums? Can we trust the casts, the renderings, the artistic choices that fill these spaces between these fragments? And then I found something else. The funding connections, as I mentioned. All these expeditions are reinforced by wealthy industrialists. There are field notes that mention investors' names more often than the scientists. Record reserved for only private display. It's hard to verify any of this, but it paints a picture of control, a story of the past, carefully curated by the wealthy. It's easy to dismiss all of this as coincidence or paranoia or craziness, but late at night, as you read these things, you start to see a pattern of selection, of secrecy, of control, and you realize the legend of dinosaurs is not just about animals that lived millions of years ago. It's about the story we are allowed to see, the story curated for public eyes, and the parts that remain hidden, well, they can talk for themselves. I started looking at more modern sources, forums, obscure blog posts, and archived threads that didn't make it into mainstream search results. People who had worked in natural history museums, or at paleontology digs, or even students who had stumbled into restricted archives, and they were all whispering about the same unsettling ideas. One person wrote about skeletons that had been reconstructed incorrectly on purpose. They made a correction later, quietly, but never told the public about their mistake. Another mentioned fossils that were sent to private collections overseas. They were never published, they were never talked about or studied again. And the strangest thing, many of these anecdotes were corroborated by multiple unrelated sources. Again, it's not proof, of course, but the repetition, the coincidences, and the silence makes you start to wonder. Then there is the artistic choices. Many reconstructions, it turns out, were influenced by cultural factors. A massive, terrifying predator sells tickets. A gentle, long-necked giant appeals to children's books. The reconstructions were designed to capture imagination, to inspire awe, rather than to strictly reflect the bones that were found. And yet, when you visit a museum now, the skeletons seem so real. The bones are so detailed, the muscles so convincingly positioned. You forget that most of it is plaster. As steel supports these hold-up fragments, more bones that are missing are added, and sometimes entire sections are basically invented to finish this imagined creation. Some theorists online have dug into old excavation photos, and of course they notice inconsistencies. Shadows that don't match skeletons, fragments labeled as one species but photographed with another. Sometimes pieces simply vanish in the historical records. And the funding threads tie into it all. Carnegie, Rockefeller, and European industrial families poured resources into these expeditions. They had motives beyond science, way beyond it. A massive public interest in prehistory could justify museums, publications, educational programs, and they could influence and even shape the scientific consensus. It's also interesting to consider how dinosaurs became central to evolution education. Darwin's ideas were controversial at the time. The story of massive extinct creatures gave evolution a tangible, awe-inspiring proof. And once that narrative was published, it became difficult to challenge without being labeled as ignorant or even worse. I found an old diary entry scanned and posted by a history of science researcher, and the note reads, "If the public believes in monsters of the past, they will accept the unseen forces of nature. It is a curious power, and we must use it wisely." The line sends chills down my spine for some reason. It reads like a blueprint for shaping perception, for controlling belief. Then there were the anomalies, things that just don't fit neatly into the evolutionary story. Skeletons discovered in unlikely locations. Bones that seemed far too intact for their supposed age. Fragments that resemble modern animals more than extinct ones. Some researchers dismiss these as natural quirks or just misidentifications. But the repetition of anomalies is spread across decades and continents leaves an uneasy feeling for sure. And the internet of course is full of whispers about all these other hidden skeletons, basements in Europe and the US inaccessible to the public. They say that bones are being sent to private collectors. They are saying that specimens are labeled voluntarily incorrectly. No, they do it on purpose, they say. And some specimens they say that they destroy. Why? I don't know. There are stories from museum staff who describe unusual finds, bones that shouldn't exist, or that don't match the known record. They are often instructed to not speak about them publicly, and it's just scientific process. Some claim it is for scientific protection. Others say it's because the bones would disrupt the public image of the story. There is another old handwritten note from the 1920s. Bones were marked lost, damaged, or reserved for donor display. say that. Altered. The word echoes in your mind. Were these fossils reassembled, modified, or were they even replaced? Some people suggest that early 20th century artists and perpetrators did more than reconstruct the missing parts. They say that they fabricated them. That they created models from plaster, wood, metal, and blended real fragments with imagined shapes. They wanted to thrill the public, to get more donations, and perhaps, unknowingly or not, they shaped the story we now accept as fact. Even today, some skeletons have been altered. Strange gaps filled with casts, spines and tails repositioned, feathers added where none existed, posture corrected to match modern theories. It's all part of the story, the narrative crafted to fit the evolving imagination of science. Then there's the matter of lost fossils, as B mentioned extensively. Entire species that vanished. Boxes shipped overseas, never talked about again. Specimens that were promised to museums that never arrived. Some were apparently destroyed in shipping accidents. But the pattern is surely odd, isn't it? It's not random, it's too consistent. And of course, internet is always full of people who claim to have witnessed something and people who say they are experts in this area of science and that they've seen lies, they've seen things that don't match. Some say I saw a skeleton that shouldn't exist. Of course, none of these can be proven. But surely these repetitions make you question some narratives. Even the public reconstructions follow a pattern. Predators are terrifying. Herbivores are majestic. Everything is proportioned for maximum effect. The science is real in fragments, but the narrative carefully curated, and the spectacle of it all is unavoidable. And yet, it works. Children love it. Adults love it. Books, movies, and toys, the story will never leave. It is accepted and almost impossible to even question it without being ridiculed. Despite all of this, there is still wonder. Even if parts of the story were shaped, exaggerated, or reconstructed, dinosaurs as ideas inspire imagination, curiosity, and awe. They remind us that the earth is ancient, vast, and full of mysteries, even if some mysteries are partly invented or misused. The sense of wonder remains real. I started to realize the point of the entire investigation for this conspiracy theory. It's not about proving whether dinosaurs were real or fake. It's about questioning what we are shown, about seeing the story behind the story, about noticing gaps, the shadows, the quiet spaces where information story tells itself. And when you leave the museum, or turn off your screen or close the book, the quiet thought lingers. How much do we really know about the past? And how much of it is the story of someone who wanted us to believe? I whisper this to you now, in this dim light, with the world asleep around you. Even if dinosaurs are real, even if every fossil is genuine, the story we tell about them has always been a little larger, a little stranger, and a little darker than the bones themselves. And maybe that's the point. The mystery continues, even in the bones we see, even in the casts we touch, even in the whispers we share late at night. The mystery of it all is the fun part. The world is full of stories, and sometimes the story is more important than the truth. And with all of that madness, I will leave you for tonight. I hope that you fell asleep early, and all the whisperings I did gave you fun ideas for some relaxing and inspiring dreams. If you're still awake, thank you for listening.